So welcome everyone to today's AIRAH webinar. My name is Marie Karakla, AIRAH's Engagement and Program Coordinator. Today's webinar is brought to you by AIRAH and FPAS, Fire Protection Association Australia. This webinar will provide an overview of the significant reforms changing the way HVAC fire and smoke control systems must be assessed and endorsed when carrying out work associated with annual fire safety statement in New South Wales. I'd now like to introduce to you our presenters for today. So we have Paul with Michaela and Brett as well. So Michaela, I might pass things over to you now and you can get us underway.
Look, welcome to the webinar, everyone. Look, I know this is a topic that does sort of lead to a lot of questions and a bit of confusion at the moment in the industry. So we've got a list of questions that have already been emailed to AIRAH this week. So at the end of the presentation, we'll be running through those questions. If you've got questions and they're not addressed throughout the presentation or in the questions at the end of the presentation, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We'll get through as many of the questions as we can, and we'll sort of see what's left at the end of our hour. Paul, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about yourself and why you're here, and run through this presentation.
Sure. Okay. So I'm Paul Waterhouse. I'm the State Manager in New South Wales for FPA Australia. In that capacity, I seem to be answering a sizable proportion of the questions about FPAS and the rollout of FPAS and dealing with government in that process. So we've been pursuing this for some time, as the presentation will show, and ultimately I do a weekly webinar, a Q&A webinar, to try and answer questions. So I'm hoping nothing comes up today that I haven't come across before, but more than happy to take any questions that are put forward.
I'm Brett Fairweather. I'm just a mechanical engineer. I run some training presentations on behalf of AIRAH that are in some very related sort of areas to this, to do with essential fire safety measures and those sort of things. I'll touch on those a little bit later on, but I guess I've been fairly close to some of the issues that we'll be talking about today. So I've been paying particularly close attention to it in recent years and in the reforms as they've been happening. So I'm happy to help share what I've learned a little bit along the way here, in the hope that it helps you all in your own roles. So, back to you, Paul. You get underway, and I'll just chip in with some sort of HVAC related issues along the way.
All right. So thanks for the intros. Where are we? So we're here at the end of a decade of reform. Almost every year there's been some sort of report into fire safety in New South Wales, culminating with the Lambert Review back in 2016. And the government, when it did did a cost-benefit analysis of the review. So this is I don't know if I can get the little pointer. Hang on, do that. So when the government released the Lambert Review, they did a cost-benefit analysis on it and found that there would be approximately a $6 billion net benefit to the community of introducing fire safety reforms. And so 72 recommendations were made. So were supported by the government from the Lambert Review, one of which was looking at the issues that we're dealing with at the moment. So the review led to the release of a discussion paper on proposed changes to the Environmental Planning and Assessment Regulation. And then in October 2017, the regulation itself was passed. And this regulation really introduced 8 key areas of reform. So that was the involvement of competent fire safety practitioners in various different areas of the system, rules around the submission of plans and specifications, limited exemptions for compliance, so where buildings need to be brought up to speed but are unable to do so, BCA exemptions, some additional inspections at critical stages and with the fire brigade, documentation of performance solutions, and new standard forms for fire safety certificates and fire safety statements, which we will go through a little bit later. Today's discussion is really about 8.1. It's about the involvement of competent fire safety practitioners and how the government went about doing so, but more importantly, how industries responded to try and deliver on that. So competent fire safety practitioners under the current regulations are required to assess the performance of essential fire safety measures for an annual fire safety statement. There are a lot of acronyms, so if I use one that I don't explain, please let me know and I'll clarify it. So they assess performance of EFSMs for an annual fire safety statement. They endorse plans and specifications under clauses 136AA and 146B. They endorse 164B exemptions, which, as I suggested before, are exemptions for compliance with the current building code, and they endorse performance-based solutions. They do not certify installation. They're not conducting building audits, and they're not signing annual fire safety statements. There's a confusion that's been built up over time that the competent fire safety practitioner is an agent of the owner, and therefore they should be signing an annual fire safety statement on behalf of the owner. The government has made that very clear that that is a conflict of interest, because the owner is meant to be saying that they've hired somebody competent, and if you're the agent of the owner, you're saying that you've hired yourself. It's not really the done thing. So the government said don't do it, and we've been encouraging the industry to push back on that particular one. They've now made changes to the form, which we'll talk about a bit later. CFSP'S in relation to HVAC. Brett, do you want to?
Yeah. So we wanted to clarify here that there's no expectation that the competent fire safety practitioner's role is to hunt around in buildings and search for an unknown number of fire dampers in the building. There's no expectation that a competent fire safety practitioner is responsible for calculating how much smoke exhaust in an existing building is enough, or to guess at any other sort of bits of information for demonstrating the performance of a system when there's no information on the side, or a lack of information that defines that lack of performance. Now, in reality, these buildings that are being assessed and endorsed on an annual basis, there is a significant lack of information there. So obviously knowing how to help the building owner find the information that relates to their assets is going to be a really valuable skill in this role. But it's not an expectation that stepping into a building to carry out an assessment requires you to actually find out what that building should do. It should be properly documented beforehand, and the fire safety schedule associated with the building should properly document the standard of performance that the assessment's being carried out to. Thanks, Paul.
And indeed, the expectation is not that you're crawling through crawl spaces or getting yourself completely covered by spider webs and dust. It's really the assessment should be able to be done without having to go to that sort of level. So there are a few challenges. In the current system, certifiers for design and owners for fire safety assessment have had to satisfy themselves that somebody's competent to be a fire safety practitioner. So the government very helpfully decided to release a guideline which said what you should be asking for, but it didn't actually tell you what competence was. So there's been a big lack of clarity in the system about how you determine if somebody's competent and what they're able to do for your building. So this uncertainty has specifically been, from our perspective, in relation to the design of fire systems and assessing buildings for annual fire safety assessment. And this is where we've been stepping in. At the moment, there's a piece of the puzzle that's missing in the regulation, which is fire system certification. So you need to be a competent fire safety practitioner to design a system. You need to, but you don't need to have that to install it. And if you're certifying that the system has been installed in accordance with the design, there is no requirement to be a CFSP there. You only have to be a person suitably qualified. And we, in our original proposal to government, recommended that actually be a certified, an accredited role. The government pulled that out of the regulation at the last minute. So there are some parts of the process that need to be revised. But ultimately, the aim of these reforms is really to try and improve safety across the board and ensure that people know what they're doing and can be held accountable. So, Brett.
Yeah, we're aware that FPA Australia and AIRAH are receiving a lot of queries about, well, why have you done this to us all, and why haven't you solved all of this? And I just want to really reinforce and I guess support FPA Australia's work here. they didn't create this. AIRAH didn't create this. It was a reform that was clearly necessary in the industry. Many of you would be aware of buildings that have been signed off for many years where there are either knowingly or unknowingly issues that haven't been investigated far enough, and the building owners and the general public or the occupants of the building deserve a better level of safety. So just reinforcing what Paul's been talking about, the New South Wales government amended the regulation that requires all of this back in October 2017. So at that time, there was a requirement for then the industry to come up with a way of dealing with this. So the industry was invited to develop appropriate accreditation schemes for these issues. A number of organisations started that. They applied to go through that process, but FPA Australia was the only one who followed through. So that's why the scheme that's in place now is the only one that's currently available. So FPA's existing FPAS platform was a pretty appropriate spot to be dealing with this, but obviously they're not so much dealing with mechanical services. So AIRAH has provided some support in development of the assessment questions that are in there at the moment for AFSS activities, and as Paul will be talking about briefly, the scheme that's in there at the moment has had provisional approval from the New South Wales government. So just explaining how this fits together a little bit and supporting where it's at. Back to you, Paul.
Thanks, Brett. So the current status of the system is that...
yeah, I was going to talk about this bit too, wasn't I?
Sorry?
I was going to talk about... Oh, no, I've got that on the screen. You go on.
That's all right. That's all right. The rehearsal didn't go as long as we thought it did. So the current status is on 22nd of February last year, Martin Hoffman, who was the then Secretary of the Department of Finance Services and Innovation, wrote to us saying that he intended to recognise the FPAS scheme for fire systems design and fire safety assessment under Clause 167 of the EPA regs within 12 months. But this was subject to conditions being met, and there were, I think, 12 conditions we had to comply with in order to get the approval. It's important to note that this is not new legislation or new regulation. So what is happening here is our scheme is being recognised under the existing regulation. There's nothing that has to go to Parliament. There's no sort of bureaucratic hurdles on that front. It's simply recognising the scheme under the existing regs. But they were being recognised under, as mentioned before, Clause 136AA and 146B for fire systems design, and for fire safety assessment Part 9, which is Divisions 5 and 7. Sorry, just clicked it, of the EPA regulation. And that was to ensure that you had competent fire safety practitioners who could endorse plans and specifications at the start, and who, for annual fire safety assessments, could endorse measures and say they were performing to the standard, or quite capable of performing to the standard they were meant to achieve.
Okay, so I'll try and explain what we think this means for mechanical services. So for designers, generally the role of a competent fire safety practitioner will apply to systems such as those that we'd find in AS 1668 Part 1 or BCA Spec E2.2B for smoke exhaust and those sort of things. So the role during the design is that the competent fire safety practitioner needs to endorse that or approve that the design is compliant with the relevant requirements before any works can commence on those systems. There is no accreditation yet available for mechanical designers as competent fire safety practitioners. You still need to be competent. You just need to be able to demonstrate your competency to the private certifier or to the building owner. That's where that's at the moment. Next slide, please, Paul. Thank you. So when we're dealing with activities associated with an annual fire safety statement, this competent fire safety practitioner role for mechanical services will relate to the mech services that are listed on the fire safety schedule, the FSS. So the competent fire safety practitioner is then required to endorse that the installed system is still performing as it did or to that minimum level of standard at the time when it was originally approved and added to that fire safety schedule. So it's not testing it to the latest standards, getting the latest airflows, latest pressures, all of those sort of things. It's checking that it's still doing what it was supposed to do at the time that it was commissioned, supposedly correctly commissioned, and then approved for, the building was approved for occupancy. So there is a requirement that competent fire safety practitioners will very soon need to be accredited for any of these endorsements. It's no longer just a self-assessment or a claim of your own competency. There's an accreditation process in place now, and we'll be highlighting some numbers later of those who've actually already been through this. But that's where we now need to obviously listen to Paul a little bit again, just to explain a bit more of the details of the FPAS scheme. Back to you, Paul.
Thanks, Brent. So we've got, as I mentioned before, we've got 12 months, or we were given 12 months initially. Obviously, it's taken a little bit longer than that, and I'll go into that in a moment. The reason for this period was to ensure, first of all, that we complied with all the conditions that were set for us, and secondly, that we had enough people in the system to be able to carry out the work. So the government wanted to make sure that we didn't end up in a situation where we only had half a dozen people who could do the work, and therefore they had a monopoly and the industry shut down. So ultimately, we've been working towards that. So what we're talking about here, this is the FPAS scheme here. So we've got design, we've got all the way through to a fire safety assessment here, and the different levels we have. What we're talking about here, if it's, my mouse is going to work for me, which it doesn't look like it is. Sorry, something's gone wrong here. That's not a good sign.
It's locked up, has it?
It's locked up.
Okay.
As indeed.
We can see your cursor there.
Yeah. No, it just said restart it. Sorry about this.
I'll start sharing the screen if that helps.
Yeah. If you want to do that, that might be a better option, because it's clearly not happy with my one.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. Just give me a second.
So we're up to slide 13.
Yep.
I'll just stop share. My apologies. The joys of Zoom presentations.
We've seen it go much worse, Paul.
So what we're looking at here is really the universe of FPAS. The only regulated measures, if you want to click the button, Brett, design, and the next one is fire safety assessment. So these are the only ones that the government is formally recognising. We have accreditation in some of the other areas, but these are the only ones that we that we have been dealing with. So next slide. What we're looking at is a co-regulatory system. So the government has made a decision that, if we can go back one, you've gone too far. Sorry.
Sorry, here we go.
Yeah, that's right. So the government made a decision that it didn't want to be in the driving seat. It wanted industry to step up and to lead with accreditation and to effectively to manage the whole process. What this means is that from an industry perspective, this is actually not a bad thing, because it means you've got people who understand the industry, who are determining the future of the industry and working towards it, and the practitioners who know those associations well. It also means that there is actually enforcement. So what's been happening over the last 2 years with the CFSP process prior to accreditation is that there's been no enforcement from government, and so people have just done what they wanted to, rather than actually adhering to proper processes and to ensuring that the system was working. Ultimately, what this comes down to is that on the recognition date, the government will gazette the scheme and basically say that from that point on the scheme is required, which means that from that date you'll have to have an accreditation number in order to be able to do the work. So if we can go to the next one. So in January of this year, Kevin Anderson, the Minister for Better Regulation and Innovation, put out a release saying that he'd be recognising the scheme formally, or that the department would be recognising the scheme formally on the 6th of April this year. This led to a pretty sizable influx of people who suddenly realised that we weren't just saying it, that the government was actually looking to do this. And so we've been trying to process those people accordingly. However, if you go to the next slide, this has now been postponed, basically because of coronavirus and the implications that's had for ensuring delivery of the scheme. The government has decided to postpone it now till the 1st of July. This is the final date. There will be no more postponements. So 1st of July is the date we're working towards, and we're going quite well in terms of knocking off all the conditions we need. It's important to note as well that the 1st of July is the date that the Building and Development Certifiers regulation also commences. So it's sort of brought those two pieces of regulation into alignment. Up until that date, any practitioner who's currently doing fire safety assessment or fire systems design can continue to do the work regardless of whether or not they have an accreditation number. So if you're doing fire safety assessment at the moment and the property manager says you have to have a number, you can actually say that this is not the case, that you can continue to do the work up until the scheme is gazetted. However, the client is still within their rights to say, no, they want to have somebody who's got an accreditation number. So if you're thinking of continuing to do fire safety assessment, it is important to make sure that, that you get through the process as soon as you can. From a systems design perspective, as Brett mentioned before, mechanical is not captured by the FPAS scheme at the moment, and so therefore that's just business as usual. You'll still have to continue demonstrating your knowledge and confirming to the client that you are competent by providing them with relevant information. If you're interested in seeing who's currently accredited for fire safety assessment, you can go to our website. There's a link from the website itself to the Connect pages, and that's got the list of fire safety assessors. So
quite a big list now.
It's getting bigger, it's certainly getting bigger. So we've got that for design and for fire safety assessment. We've got two registers there. So the next slide.
Yep.
As we mentioned before, this isn't a new responsibility. The regulation changed back in 2017, and this is being recognised under existing regulations. The change or the recognition of accreditation also will not change what the owners or PCAs are required to do. So at the moment, the regulation says that an owner for fire safety assessment is meant to make a written declaration as to why they think the person is competent. At the end of the day, I don't think many owners have actually been doing this, but the point of the written declaration is really to make sure that they've actually looked into the background of the person who's doing the work for them and ensured they're able to do it. That responsibility won't change, because ultimately, if I give an accreditation number, that doesn't tell you as an owner that I'm competent to do the work that I'm saying I'm prepared to do. So you have a responsibility to go and look at the register and confirm that I can do mechanical air handling systems, that I'm actually accredited for that, so that I can sign that measure off on the fire safety statement. The onus is on the owner to make sure that they're doing that. But similarly, there's a responsibility for the practitioner to make sure that they're actually being honest about what they can do, so that there's a level of trust there. But it's not sufficient just to give a number and the owner goes, well, I'm covered because you give me an accreditation number. Because if something goes wrong, the coroner's not going to say, that's okay, you had a number. The coroner's going to say, why didn't you make sure that this person knew what they were doing? So there's still that responsibility. So next slide.
Yeah, it's coming apparently. Here it is.
There we go. As I said, so we're currently accepting people into transitional accreditation. So what this means is we're recognising people's experience and testing their knowledge of the process of assessment, so that we can accept them into the scheme. The government is requiring us to ensure that within 4 years of accreditation, of somebody being accredited, or the start of the scheme, whichever is the later, each practitioner is going to have to be fully qualified. We will be allowed to accept people under the transitional criteria for a year after commencement. So up until the 1st of July or the 30th of June 2021, we can continue to accept people as competent based on their experience. But after that, we will have to have people who've done the qualifications. So we've written to the government with proposals of what the qualifications should be. And we're waiting to hear back from them as to whether they accept what we've proposed. Once that's been accepted, then we'll be advertising what the quals are, and you can gain those qualifications from anybody, any RTO that currently offers them. In terms of the process after that, we will be conducting an exam to make sure that the competence level is there. So it's necessary but not sufficient to tell us that you've done the quals. We actually have to make you do an exam so that we can make sure that you've actually learnt from it. You haven't just gone to some back alley RTO that gives you a certificate without actually training you. So there will be process there, but the qualified pathway will be the way that new entrants join the industry or join the profession after 1st of July 2021. So
okay. Can I just recap my understanding of that? So up until about now, since the reform, since the regulation change, has been a requirement to effectively convince the building owner or the PCA you're competent in your role. As of about now, and well, it'll actually be 1st of July, you'll not only need to claim you're competent, but you can sit an assessment to prove you're competent in those particular areas. The next step will relate to the qualifications.
yes.
Sorry, back to you.
Yep. So a quick summary of design. Obviously, this doesn't relate to mechanical at the moment, but at some stage down the track, it will. We have to offer 3 levels of accreditation for relevant fire safety systems. So relevant fire safety systems are hydrants, hose reels and sprinklers, detection alarm systems and mechanical air handling systems. We are currently providing accreditation for fire sprinkler systems, fire hydrant and hose reel systems and fire detection alarm systems. And that's in 3 categories, which we'll go into in a moment. In terms of other areas of interest, we will be looking at mechanical air handling down the track, and we'll be working with AIRAH on that form of accreditation, and we'll be looking at exit emergency lighting and passive fire protection as well. So we want to try and ensure that eventually everybody in the industry has who's doing design has some form of accreditation to ensure that there's that level of competence. The 3 levels that I mentioned before, level 3, 2, or 1. Level 1 practitioners are really dealing with minor works or tenancy retrofits, refits. Level 2 is more significant work, but still relatively not sort of fully fledged systems. And level 3 is generally looking at much more complicated systems and bigger buildings and the like. Practitioners can actually target whichever level they're looking to do based on their own level of experience and what they prefer to continue working in. Next slide. Okay, so for fire safety assessment, the 2 of the most important clauses are 175 and 176. Under these clauses, a competent fire safety practitioner must identify the required standard of performance for each EFSM, assess, inspect and verify each of these measures as per regulation 176.3 to ensure that they're performing as required. So this is a step beyond routine service. So the idea behind fire safety assessment is it's not just going in and doing what you do for a monthly routine service visit. It's actually taking a step beyond, looking at the system laterally. And the key word here in line 2 is inspect. It is not sufficient for a practitioner to send a technician along to a building to do all the assessment and then they just sign the measure in the comfort of their own office. The practitioner who is accredited must be the one who goes out and looks at the system to ensure, first of all, that the system is working, that there's nothing standing out that's of concern, sprinkler systems that are leaking or anything like that. But secondly, to make sure that the technicians are actually telling them the truth. If you've got a technician who's done a drive-by and who's just filled in details from the cabin of their ute and hasn't actually gone into the building, then inspecting the building will actually give you an opportunity to check on that and to make sure that the systems are working as they're supposed to be. The final area they have to look at is inspecting exits and paths of travel, and this is to ensure that there's no breach of Division 7 of Part 9. Division 7 is talking about fire signs, exit signs, fire exits, paths of travel and the like. So it's looking to make sure, essentially it's looking after the most important form of fire safety, which is egress, that people can get out of a building safely. And so it's making sure that those features in the building are still intact and clear of any obstruction. We are accrediting individuals to perform all of the assessments on all of the fire safety measures listed in clause 166 of the EPNA reg. So 166 lists what the government considers to be the essential fire safety measures, and we have accreditation to cover all of those. as well as Division 7 compliance. So the entire fire safety assessment process will be accredited from this point on. When it comes to routine service, the point to make here is that routine service records are necessary but not sufficient for fire safety assessment. So that information will inform you as to how the system is tracking, but it's not enough to just to look at those results and think that that tells you how the system's performing. You still have to do that inspection. Next one.
Yep. Keyword there is perform, I think, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So it's got to be capable of performing to the standard to which it was originally designed.
Not just existing.
Yes. So for fire systems design, we currently have, as of this morning, 128 accredited designers, and they're across 82 in sprinklers, 79 in hydrants and hose reels, and 66 in detection and alarm systems. Actually, I think that's the other way around. I think the detection is the top one, but it's a spread. That's probably the best way to describe it. So, and to put it in perspective, the government's threshold for recognition was 100. So we've passed that threshold, but we've still got a lot of people who've applied that we need to work through the system. And as I said, some of those will be in the restricted categories. As Brett and I mentioned before, mechanical designers are not being accredited yet. And we don't have an accreditation yet for 164B exemptions as well. So those two functions will still have to, people doing that work will still have to demonstrate their competence to the system certified, so the PCA, so that they can demonstrate they're appropriate to do the work.
So competency is still mandatory, it's just there's no assessment to back up anyone's claims of competency yet.
It's essentially business as usual at the moment, yeah. For fire safety assessment, as of this morning, 887 people have submitted an application to be an assessor. We have a further 628 individuals who are completing their application. So what this means is, if any of you have turned up to one of the FPA's events where we've talked about this, some time ago I was talking about a target being 800 people to be accredited for fire safety assessment. We potentially can get to that. I don't think we'll get to that by 1st of July. There are a lot of exams to be done before we can get there, but we can get to that level. But a couple of years ago, Bill Lee, our president, was talking about there needing to be 1,500 people carrying out fire safety assessment. So we can technically, if we can get the 628 people to submit their applications, and if we can get all those people through the system, we could actually hit the threshold that the bill worked out we needed across New South Wales. So it's reasonably healthy numbers, and we're hoping that over the next month we can get the remaining people through the system to be accredited. We have, as of this morning, 431 people who've got their accreditation number. Now, they will not necessarily have passed all of the exams that they've set out to do, but they will have passed at least one, and they're only accredited for the exams they've passed. So each exam they pass after that will be added to their profile, but they're only accredited for what they've currently passed. There are 515 people in total who have passed at least one exam, so who are eligible for accreditation, and 91% of exams have been passed. So that's not necessarily on the first sitting. Sometimes they've failed the first one and had to resit it, but in total, 91% of applicants have got through the exams.
Yeah, probably fair to say, don't turn up unprepared.
Definitely not.
Yeah, but you know, if you have been carrying out your work correctly, you should be familiar with the requirements. So that's generally speaking there. If we just look at how this relates to mechanical services, there are only 4 measures that relate specifically to HVAC systems. So of fire dampers, you can see there, 154 practitioners currently accredited, smoke dampers 92, mechanical air handling systems 99, and smoke and heat vents, while it's not always a mechanical service, it's bundled in this group as well, 118 currently accredited. And you can see some other numbers there for those who've sat the exams and those who've actually applied for it, to give you a bit of an indication of what's happening there. So back to you, Paul.
So they've been reasonably popular, but you know, we haven't had a lot of people who've gone through the process. So this slide's just showing you the application process. So essentially, you complete and submit your application form, and you pay an application fee. You attend an awareness session, or at least you used to attend an awareness session where you'd be bored senseless by me talking for 4 hours and trying to look like I know the answers to the questions. But now we've managed to record that as 14 individual modules that you get to sit through instead. So it's still listening to me, but you don't have to deal with me in person. Once you've sat through each of the modules in part and gone through those, you sit the fundamentals assessment online, which is now a 2-part exam. And passing that opens up the opportunity to do each fire safety measure. So essentially, once you've sat one of the fire safety measure exams, that's when you can apply for your accreditation. So at that point, you submit your insurance certificates and you pay the annual accreditation fee. We process the certificates and confirm the accreditation number at that point. Now, a couple of things to note here. Firstly, there are 2 payments. So we get a lot of people who think it's just the one payment and that's it. You don't have to worry about it anymore. That's not, unfortunately, that's not the case. The first payment covers the whole exam process. It covers all the software we need to run, the processing of applications, and making sure that we're on track with that. The second payment is the annual accreditation. And that covers the ongoing management of the system, but also, most importantly, and we'll talk a bit more about it later, auditing. So we're required to audit 10% of practitioners every year, and that means we have to have an individual in the role. We've got somebody who's a former Queensland police officer, so he knows how to deal with anybody who, if they're trying to cause trouble. We have to sort of maintain his services to ensure that people are being properly audited, and that we've got an appeals panel that's funded if somebody doesn't like what we've made decisions on. So that's the first thing. There are 2 payments. The second thing to note is with the insurance certificates, we need to have certain words on the certificates in order to approve the accreditation. So that means that if you're seeking accreditation for design, it has to say fire systems design on your certificate of currency. And if you're looking to do fire safety assessment, it has to say fire safety assessment on it. And the reason for that is to make sure that the insurance does cover that particular function. You need 2 types of insurance: public and product liability, and professional indemnity insurance. And both of those, the certificates for both of those have to state that you're carrying out that particular work. But once you've got accreditation, you end up on our register, and you have a number, and you can use that to endorse measures that you've passed on the annual fire safety statements. Next slide. So the awareness session is essentially just a bit of a ready reckoner. Remember that we are accrediting people who are experienced already. So we're assuming that you actually know a lot of this information, but what we've found is that there's what we assume people know and what people actually know doesn't always align. And so the awareness session is really to talk about what the role is of a fire safety assessor, how the building code and standards and regulations work in relation to the role, how you deal with performance solutions, what 1851 covers, and most importantly at the top there, some information about Division 7 and how you assess notices, exits, doors relating to exits and paths of travel. So it really is going through all of the different information that you should know as a practitioner in order to be able to assess you. So to ensure that you've got through that gateway. Essentially, the fundamentals exam is just making sure that you understand the role and that there are certain things you need to do. And the benefit about the fundamentals exam is you get to take in the slide deck, or you get to access the slide deck while you're doing the exam. So most of the answers are in the slide deck. So if you're listening closely in the awareness presentation, you should be able to pass that exam relatively easily. Next slide.
But just to add to that, I think the gaps in gaps in knowledge, as minor as they might be in some areas, I think it really just supports the fact that there was reform necessary in this area, and this is really just aligning everyone's work in these roles throughout the industry.
Yeah, I mean, to reinforce that, if the industry was doing the right thing, the government wouldn't have stepped in and required accreditation. So this is a feature of the fact that there was a lot of poor performance in the industry, and to be honest, a bit of a race to the bottom, which meant that people were doing things that they weren't really qualified to do, and were not charging anything for it and driving other people out of business. So this is really to try and address that. So to be accredited, you have to sign a code of professional conduct, and this outlines a whole lot of expectations we have of you and how you should be performing, particularly in terms of ethical conduct. So you're not allowed to trash competitors. You're not. We ask you not to trash us. I know there are a few people out there who would like to trash us because they don't want to do accreditation, but unfortunately, we sort of expect that you're going to be nice to us. And really talking about how to be, you need to be professional all the time. So you can't look at assessment work as an opportunity to upsell or to try and get an advantage over other people. It really is, you've got to behave ethically all the time. And we go through a lot in the awareness session about the need to keep records. And that's a key thing to take away from this and really any of the discussions about FPAS, that record keeping is fundamental to ensuring that you are protected and that you are informing clients of the information they need to know. So even if a client chooses not to do something, if you've advised them in your report to them that they should be looking into doing it, or they should be hiring somebody to do certain works, then that just covers you if something goes wrong. So we had an example recently, if I can just go off a slight tangent, where there was a system that needed a five-yearly test. The tester said that they weren't going to do it unless they were indemnified. The insurer of the client refused to indemnify the tester because if it went wrong, there could be significant costs. And the fire safety assessor was in the middle going, but hang on, we need this test in order to confirm that the system can cope under pressure. And he was sort of saying, well, what do I do? And really the answer, as far as I could work out, not being a practitioner, was it was working on town water. So you can say it's working on town water, but you say to the client, you need to get this 5-yearly test done, and I might not be able to sign it off next year if this isn't done, and here's why you need to do this test. Chief amongst it is, if the system doesn't cope under pressure, it could explode and kill a firefighter. So you actually need to understand that that is the risk. So as practitioners, you need to be prepared to go and talk to or provide reports to clients that outline all the information they need to know to make the right decision, which arguably we should be doing already anyway, but there are several in the industry who haven't been doing that. So it's really about documenting every decision you make and the reasons for that decision, and advising the client of everything they need to know to make an informed decision about their own buildings. So next. You also must carry insurance, as I mentioned before. So that's $10 million public and products liability, and $2 million including defence costs, or $1 million without defence costs for public liability for any one claim. Now, if you're working for a company, you're covered by that company's insurance, and so it's the company insurance that you get to submit. If you change employers, you need to make sure that that company is still maintaining their insurance for that work as well, because a claim can be made any time for up to 10 years. And if the company is not covered by insurance at that time, then even if it's work that happened when they were insured, you can't get the protection from the insurer. So as a practitioner, you've got to keep reasonably nice relationships with your former employers to make sure that you know that they're still covered, so that you know you're still covered for the work you did for them. This is not any different than is currently required for principal certifying authorities. So building surveyors must have the same insurance and must be covered for up to 10 years with no gaps. We're just having the same benchmark applied to us too. I mentioned before about the audits. So we have to audit 10% of practitioners every year. We'll probably start audits 6 months after accreditation, so that people actually have a reasonable amount of work they can pull together to show us. And again, we're going to be looking for the decision-making processes and the evidence behind that. So we're not looking for, the aim is not to do gotcha moments or anything like that. We're looking to make sure that you've done the right thing in terms of documenting your work and considering how you're going to go about the process of assessment. And if you make the wrong decision, but you've documented the reasons why you made that decision, then that's going to serve you much better than if you just don't document anything and it's found to be the wrong decision. At that point, we're going to have to ask some difficult questions. So it's important to make sure that documentation is there. Similarly with complaints, the auditor will be carrying out investigation of complaints as well. This needs to be based on evidence, not on hearsay. So we can't just have one company doesn't like another company, so they complain about them every 30 seconds. That's not going to lead to an investigation. There has to be some evidence to show that they've done the wrong thing, sufficient that it's worthwhile investigating and resolving. So an example, the fire brigade, I gave a presentation to the fire brigade last year and had a fire practitioner say, well, how do we determine who's in the wrong? If I've got a client saying that somebody's charged them $40,000 for work, who's is that? How do I work out whether that work is justified or not? And the answer is really simple. Either the work was needed and the $40,000 was justified, which means that the previous practitioner was not doing their job or potentially not doing their job properly in terms of signing it off every year, or the work isn't needed because the assessments have been done properly and the new practitioner is trying to gouge the client. Either way, we've got somebody we can investigate and somebody we can chastise for doing the work. For proposing the work, because it's not in line with the code of practice. So we can actually the code of professional conduct. We can actually take action against them. And now it means that anybody out in the public, so whether it's the brigade or occupants of a building or a building owner, can actually turn to somebody to make a complaint. They don't have to throw their hands up in the air and say nobody's covering it. We'll be able to deal with this. In terms of investigations, we are not looking to remove people's accreditation as the first port of call. That's the nuclear option. And really, to be honest, the moment that'll be applied most frequently will be if there are examples of fraud. So if somebody's misrepresenting themselves and saying they can do work they can't, then we might start moving towards that as an option. But generally, we're looking to try and train up the industry. So if you've made a genuine mistake and it's because you haven't really understood something about the system, or you've been rushed and haven't been able to finish something or what have you, we will look to try and do training and point you in the right direction rather than just every complaint is resulting in loss of an accreditation number, because it's not in the interest of the industry to kick people out for minor reasons. It's much better if we're actually working with the practitioners to improve so that we can actually deliver better service for the customer. Of course, if you don't agree with our decision, there is an accreditation appeals panel, and that's populated by experts and stakeholders who will hear any opposition to a decision, and will make a recommendation back to the FPA to determine where we should go. But if we make a decision and the appeals panel endorses the decision, if it goes to that level, we have to inform the secretary of what we've done, and that has to be recorded in the register as well. So there's a whole lot of process we've got to follow to make sure that the community knows what has happened with practitioners and whether they're able to perform the role they're currently performing. We are going to be doing training as well. I do like that little man's training style. I think that next time I do a presentation, I'm going to have the hand on hip the same way. We are going to be doing awareness sessions for applicants. Obviously, we're doing that at the moment. We're also doing formal workshops on certain subject matter areas. So Brett did one earlier this week. We've got a couple coming up in the middle of June, where we're looking at areas that people are having the most trouble with at the moment, and trying to just give them a bit more education about what they need to consider. And we'll be picking other areas as time goes on. So if there are areas where we think there are particular deficiencies, they'll be first port of call for events. But otherwise, we'll be looking to make sure that we're providing the right service or the right topics to help you get your improve your training. You have to do, as an accredited practitioner, you have to do 20 CPD points every 12 months. It can be across any category, and you don't have to do it for every single EFSM. So we're not expecting you to do 20 for mechanical, 20 for fire dampers, 20 for smoke dampers, and so on. It's just 20 across the board. But the idea here is just making sure that you're up to date with issues that are important and able to to demonstrate an ongoing commitment to learning and development. And as with everything we do, we're developing good practice guides, and they're intended to support the industry and help practitioners understand what they need to do.
Some good guides there. I should say number 5 in particular is quite useful when you turn up to a site and there's no documentation for any of the systems on the site, and just helping you work out some of the troubleshooting processes and how to work with the building owner to try and get some documentation back in order.
So I mentioned the new forms, and Brett will go
actually
into these a little bit more.
Highlight a couple of the important points on these forms. So these forms are mandatory. You can't just start using your own forms anymore. Everyone has to use the same form, which I'm sure many of you will agree is a refreshing change, where we're looking at the same information on every building. So some key points just from what we have been talking about there. On the fire safety statement there will be a list of fire safety measures. That list has a column in there for the minimum standard of performance. That is the standard of performance that the measures are being tested against. So it may have a reference to a standard. Importantly, it would need to have the year number because things change. Or there may be a reference to a fire engineering report or some of those sort of things. It'll also have the assessment date and the initials of the individual competent fire safety practitioner that looked at that measure. There are then some personal details of each of the competent fire safety practitioners. So there's real personal responsibility coming into this. And the last bit is the owner or the owner's agent taking some responsibility here as well, and declaring that they've selected someone who has assessed the measure to be capable of performing, again, performing being a key word, not just existing and functioning, but performing, to a standard no less than that specified on the schedule. Remember, the schedule is the bit on the front page that says what that standard of performance should be. Now, in addition to those 2 pages, there are 3 additional pages that tell you how to read and use the forms. And that's particularly useful probably when you're having discussions with building owners about what you can and what you can't say on the form and who needs to sign what. There's all sorts of supporting information written by the government there on how this is intended to be used. So
Brett,
just go on.
I was just going to say, if you could point your cursor just above section 8 there. No, yep. Just above that. Yeah, so just above that, there's at the bottom of that, you'll see there's just a line of text. That line basically says that if your name appears in section 6, you cannot put your details in section 7. So the government has now changed the form to make sure that you as the person doing the assessment cannot be the agent for the owner. And that's clarified at a lot of it. So if you get owners saying you need to be my agent because you're working for me, just point them to that line, and if they don't believe that one, then go to the relevant section in the 3 pages of notes, and it'll make it very clear that you can't be the assessor and be the owner's agent. If you're not doing the assessment, you can sign that section, but if you're doing any assessment of any feature in the building, even Division 7, you cannot have your name listed. You cannot be the person listed as signing on behalf of the owner.
Yeah, if your name's here, you can't be listed up here.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So some of the timelines that Paul's been talking about there. So after 1st of July this year is when the next real step kicks in. So accreditation through the FPAS scheme for fire safety assessors is necessary. It's required to endorse the annual fire safety statement measures, the measures, the measure of performance. So endorsements as AFSS activities there. Design from 1st of July. Accreditation is necessary for smoke detectors, hydrants, sprinklers and things, but there is no change for HVAC design. There is still a responsibility to be competent, but needing to demonstrate to the PCA or the owner is what needs to happen there. Now, some PCAs and some owners may request that you've got NER or your C9 accreditation, some of those sort of things. That's going to be up to them. And also after 1st of July 2021, the only qualified pathway will be new entrants in the FSD or FSA. And then there's 4 years after the accreditation is granted that the next phase really kicks in and moving to full qualifications there. Okay, I'll let you just summarise there, Paul.
So yeah, look, the reason that FPA went down the line of doing this, and yeah, this was quite a courageous decision by the board. It cost us over $1 million to get the system set up, and it took 18 months. So it was a fair whack of work to try and get it through. The reason we did this was to give clients confidence about the industry and to lift the level of professionalism within the fire safety sector. This is obviously going to take some time to bed down. So for the next few months, there will still be some problems, and we'll have to work hard to help bring people up to speed. But the attitude is changing out there. There are a lot of people who were talking several months ago about it being fine to sign things from their desk, and now they're the most staunchly determined to ensure that people don't do that anymore. So there is a change in attitude, which is good, and that will continue. We're going to keep working with government and our industry partners so that we can fix the regulations up. One of the things we're trying to do at the moment is fix up fire safety schedules, which anecdotally 80% of schedules have problems with them. We want to try and make it easier to fix those up so we don't end up having lots of issues with buildings where the fire safety schedules just don't have the right information.
Only 80%.
So say it again?
Only 80%.
Well, anecdotally 80%. Yeah. So there've got to be some there that are right, but yeah. And look, the problem with the fire safety schedules, just as a tangent, is that when the people who designed the regulatory change did so, they assumed that everybody would do the right thing first time every time. So they didn't actually factor in human error, and they didn't allow for a system that would enable people to fix up mistakes that have been made. And so that's been the shortfall, and that's what we're trying to fix up. But as I said earlier, accreditation, from our perspective, provides certainty to everybody in the system, not just the owners and managers or the building certifiers, but also the practitioners themselves, who now know that there's a benchmark they need to meet in order to keep doing this work, and that everybody else is on the same playing field, which means that arguments about people being undercut for work because somebody's going to be less stringent and charge less, those will eventually go out the window, those arguments, because people have to pay for their accreditation, and in order to keep employing and keep themselves employed, they're going to have to charge an appropriate amount to make it worth their while. So this is going to see a level of responsibility and professionalism lift the value of the industry overall, and make becoming an assessor an attractive proposition rather than just something you add on to your routine service. So as I said previously, we're currently in transitional accreditation. You need to move towards qualified accreditation within 4 years of your accreditation commencing, or the scheme starting, whichever is the later. And we will have processes in place to allow that. And in the mechanical space, we're working very closely with AIRAH to make sure that the things we have in place for HVAC from a fire safety perspective align with current practices, and that we can actually improve systems across the board.
Okay, now we're just about to get to the Q&A session, but I think it's worth just touching on some of the areas where AIRAH may be able to help those of you looking for a bit more information here. These are some courses that have been around for a while now that AIRAH has been offering training on, and AIRAH remains committed to offering training in this area. Now, these courses do not provide accreditation. So one of the big questions is, I sat one of these, I sat through one of the days of whether it was me or Simon Hill before me running through these, am I now a competent fire safety practitioner? Well, the short answer is no. These were created back in the mid to late 2000s and have been running since then. But those of you who have been through these, I guess you can chat amongst yourselves to how much they are aligned with the sort of work you would be doing in these areas, but they do cover a lot of similar issues. So the one on the left there, essential safety measures, is ideal for those who are working in the AFSS activities. And the one on the right, smoke control and fire dampers, is where we go into more details relevant to the designers and design activities. So both of these courses, as well as a number of others that AIRAH are now moving into the online space, these are available as online, as face-to-face, once we're able to do that again. or as in-house sessions where you may have a team that's large enough to warrant just running it in-house. So you can contact AIRAH for more information on that.